There's something about Canada in the 1960s that just sticks with you. The neighborhoods, the family rituals, the way people treated each other. And if you grew up then, you'll know exactly what I mean. I'm talking about a time when Canada was finding its own voice, when families could afford a house on one income, when kids played outside until the streetlights came on, and when your neighbors weren't just people next door, they were like extended family. This was the decade that gave us our new flag, universal health care, and a sense that anything was possible. The war was behind us, the future looked bright, and being Canadian meant something special. We're going to walk through what daily life actually felt like back then, from the music that filled our living rooms to the way entire communities came together. Some of this might make you smile. Some of it might make you wish you could go back. Let's step into that world. If you lived in a Canadian city or town in the 1960s, you knew your neighbors. Not just their names, but their kids' names, what time they left for work, and whether they took sugar in their tea. Fences between houses were low, maybe 3 feet high, specifically so people could chat over them while hanging laundry or tending to their gardens. Nobody felt the need to hide behind tall privacy fences because there was nothing to hide from. One viewer remembers how her mother would borrow a cup of sugar from Mrs. Henderson next door, and Mrs. Henderson would send back not just the sugar, but also fresh butter tarts she'd made that morning. That's just how things worked. People looked out for each other without being asked. Community meant something real back then. If someone on your street got sick, meals would appear on their doorstep without anyone organizing it. If it snowed overnight, neighbors would help each other shovel driveways before heading to work. Kids could knock on any door on the block if they needed help, and parents trusted that their children were safe playing streets away from home. There was this understanding that everyone was responsible for everyone else, not just their own family. That sense of collective care created neighborhoods that felt less like random houses grouped together, and more like actual communities where people genuinely cared about each other's well-being. And speaking of kids playing in the streets, childhood in 1960s, Canada was completely different from today. Parents would send their children outside after breakfast, and the only rule was to come home when the streetlights turned on. No cell phones to check in, no constant supervision, just pure freedom to explore, create, and play. Kids would build forts in the woods, play road hockey until someone's mom called them for dinner, ride bikes all over town, and create their own entertainment without any adult input. Boredom wasn't something to be fixed immediately with a screen or organized activity. Boredom was the starting point for imagination and creativity. One viewer shared how he and his friends would take their sleds to the biggest hill in town during winter, spending entire Saturdays going up and down that hill until their clothes were soaked through and their faces were red from cold. Nobody worried about liability or safety equipment beyond a warm coat and boots. Parents understood that kids might fall, might get bruises, might come home dirty and exhausted, and that was all part of growing up. The freedom to take small risks and learn from them was considered essential to childhood, not something to be prevented at all costs. Now let's talk about something that defined Canadian identity in the 1960s more than almost anything else. February 15, 1965. That's when Canada officially adopted the maple leaf flag, replacing the old red ensign. This wasn't just a design change. This was Canada saying, we're our own country with our own identity, separate from Britain, confident in who we were becoming. The debate about the flag had been fierce, with some Canadians loving the modern new design and others feeling loyal to the traditional British symbols. But when that red and white flag with its distinctive maple leaf was raised for the first time on Parliament Hill, something shifted in the national consciousness. We had our own symbol now, something that was uniquely and unmistakably Canadian. That same spirit of building a distinct Canadian identity showed up in other ways too. In 1967, Canada turned 100 years old, and the centennial celebrations were unlike anything the country had seen before. Expo 67 in Montreal brought the world to Canada, showcasing Canadian innovation, culture, and optimism on an international stage. Over 50 million people visited Expo 67, experiencing the geodesic dome of the American Pavilion, the stunning Canadian Pavilion, and exhibits from countries around the world. For many Canadians, especially those living in smaller towns and rural areas, Expo 67 was their first real exposure to international culture and modern design. It felt like Canada was announcing itself as a modern, forward-thinking nation ready to take its place on the world stage. The 1960s also brought universal health care to Canada, province by province. Saskatchewan had led the way in 1962, and by the end of the decade, the Medical Care Act of 1966 set the framework for what would become the healthcare system Canadians rely on today. Before this, families could face financial ruin from medical bills. A serious illness or injury could mean losing your house or going deep into debt. The introduction of universal health care meant that Canadians could see a doctor or go to the hospital without worrying about the cost, and this fundamentally changed how people thought about their security and future. It was a statement about Canadian values, about the belief that health care was a right, not a privilege reserved for those who could afford it. Let's talk about what it was like to actually work and live during this time. In the 1960s, a single income could support an entire family comfortably. A factory worker, a teacher, a clerk at the bank. Any of these jobs paid enough that one parent, usually the father, could work, while the other parent, usually the mother, managed the household and raised the children. Houses were affordable. A young couple could save for a down payment within a few years and get a mortgage that didn't consume their entire paycheck. The average house in Toronto in 1960 cost around $15,000. The average salary was about $4,000 a year. Do that math compared to today, and you'll see why people talk about the 1960s as a time of economic opportunity. Jobs were plentiful too. You could walk into a factory, a store, an office, and often start working the same week. Apprenticeships were common, giving young people without university degrees a path to skilled trades and good careers. There was this sense that if you were willing to work hard, you could build a good life for yourself and your family. The anxiety that defined so much of modern working life, the constant worry about job security, the need for multiple income streams, the impossibility of affording a home, those weren't major concerns for most working Canadians in the 1960s. Life felt manageable, and the future felt secure. Now, the music and culture of 1960s Canada deserves its own conversation. Canadian artists were making their mark both at home and internationally. The Guess Who from Winnipeg became one of Canada's most successful rock bands, with hits that dominated radio stations across North America. Gordon Lightfoot was crafting the folk songs that would become the soundtrack of Canadian identity. Leonard Cohen released his first album in 1967, bringing his poetic, introspective style to the world. Joni Mitchell was beginning her journey from folk clubs in Toronto to international stardom. These weren't just entertainers, they were artists who captured something essential about the Canadian experience and shared it with the world. Television brought families together in ways that seem almost foreign now. The CBC was the main connection most Canadians had to national news and entertainment. Shows like Hockey Night in Canada were absolute institutions. Saturday nights meant gathering around the television to watch the Maple Leafs, Canadiens, or whichever teams were playing. Between periods, families would chat about the game, make snacks, and then settle back in for the next period. One viewer remembers how his entire street would go quiet on Saturday nights during hockey season because every single house was tuned in to the same broadcast, watching the same game, sharing the same experience even while sitting in separate living rooms. Canadian television also gave us shows that reflected our own culture back to us. Programs like The Forest Rangers and Razzle Dazzle entertained Canadian kids with stories set in Canadian locations, featuring Canadian actors. This might not sound like a big deal, But in an era when most television content came from the United States, seeing your own country and culture represented on screen mattered. It reinforced that Canadian stories were worth telling and that Canadian experiences were valid and interesting. Let's talk about something that might seem small, but was actually a huge part of daily life. Shopping in the 1960s meant going to actual stores, often multiple stores, to get what you needed. There was no Amazon, no online ordering, no big box stores that sold everything under one roof. You went to the butcher for meat, the baker for bread, the grocer for produce and canned goods. Department stores like Eaton's and Simpson's were major destinations, places where families would spend Saturday afternoons browsing through different departments, maybe stopping at the lunch counter for a sandwich and a milkshake. These shopping trips weren't just about buying things. They were social experiences, chances to see people from your community, to chat with shopkeepers who knew you by name, to make an afternoon of something that today takes 30 seconds on a phone. Downtown areas were vibrant and alive. Main streets in Canadian towns and cities were lined with locally owned businesses, movie theaters, restaurants, and shops. People would dress up to go downtown, making it an event rather than a chore. The streets would be busy with people walking, talking, window shopping, meeting friends for coffee. There was this energy to downtown areas, this sense of community gathering spaces where people from all parts of town would cross paths and interact. The decline of these downtown cores, the move towards suburban malls and eventually online shopping, that all came later. In the 1960s, downtown was still the heart of most Canadian communities. Transportation was different too, and it shaped how people experienced their communities. Many families in the early 1960s didn't own a car, or they owned just one car that Dad took to work. People walked more, took public transit more, rode bikes more. Kids would walk to school even in winter, even in small towns where school might be a mile away. Nobody thought twice about it. Walking was just how you got places, and it meant you were more connected to your neighborhood, more aware of the small details and changes, more likely to run into people and have spontaneous conversations. By the end of the 1960s, car ownership was becoming more common, and that changed the landscape, literally and figuratively. Suburbs expanded as families could live farther from where they worked. Drive-in movies became popular date spots and family outings. Highway construction connected cities and regions in new ways. The car represented freedom and possibility, the ability to explore Canada's vast landscape, to take road trips to visit family in other provinces, to experience the country beyond your immediate area. Let's touch on something that came up in many memories from this era: trust and safety. People didn't lock their doors during the day. Sometimes they didn't even lock them at night. Kids could roam freely without parents worrying about their safety. You could leave your bike outside a store and expect it to still be there when you came out. This wasn't naivety. Crime existed in the 1960s, of course it did, but the level of casual trust that people had in their neighbors and their communities was fundamentally different from today. There was less fear, less suspicion, more benefit of the doubt given to strangers and neighbors alike. Another viewer shared a memory that perfectly captures this era. She remembers how the milkman would deliver glass bottles to their doorstep every morning before anyone woke up. And sometimes her mother would leave a note asking for an extra bottle of cream or a dozen eggs, along with the money. The milkman would read the note, leave what was requested, take the money, and leave change if needed. All based on trust, with no security cameras, no tracking, no verification systems. Just one person trusting another to be honest and fair. That's the kind of society 1960s Canada was, where systems ran on trust and mutual respect rather than surveillance and suspicion. Education in the 1960s also reflected different priorities and possibilities. Class sizes were smaller than they are today in many places. Teachers had more authority and faced less bureaucracy. Discipline was stricter, expectations were clear, and students generally respected their teachers and the learning environment. Post-secondary education was becoming more accessible, with universities expanding and tuition costs that seem almost unbelievable now. You could work a summer job and earn enough to pay for a year of university. Student debt wasn't the massive burden it has become. Education felt like an investment in your future that was actually achievable without mortgaging that future before it even started. Now, it's important to be honest that not everything about 1960s Canada was perfect. This was still a time when women faced significant barriers in the workplace and society. Indigenous peoples were dealing with the ongoing trauma of residential schools and systematic discrimination. Immigration policies were restrictive in ways that would be considered unacceptable today. The point isn't to idealize the past or pretend problems didn't exist. The point is to understand what was different, what worked, what created the strong sense of community and security that people remember from this era, and maybe what lessons we can take from that time and apply to making our own communities stronger today. What stands out most when you listen to people talk about 1960s Canada is the optimism, the sense that tomorrow would be better than today, that hard work would pay off, that their children would have even better opportunities than they did. Canada was changing rapidly, becoming more confident, more distinct, more modern, and people felt like they were part of something exciting. The economy was growing, the middle class was expanding, social programs were being created, and the country was finding its own voice, separate from Britain and distinct from the United States. This was the Canada of the 1960s, a place where community mattered more than individualism, where people trusted each other and looked out for each other, where a decent life was accessible to most working families, where kids had freedom to explore and grow, where downtown cores were vibrant gathering places, where optimism about the future was the default setting. It wasn't perfect, but it was different in ways that shaped an entire generation's understanding of what community and country could be. The neighborhoods, the rituals, the way people treated each other, these weren't just nice extras that made life pleasant. They were fundamental to how society functioned, how people understood their place in their communities, how they thought about their responsibilities to each other. Looking back at 1960s, Canada isn't about wanting to reverse progress or ignore the genuine problems that existed. It's about understanding what we've gained and what we've lost, and maybe thinking about what parts of that earlier Canada we might want to reclaim or reimagine for our own time. If this brought back memories, subscribe to keep exploring Canada's past.